Well, good morning from Mystery Island, Maryland, here, where it's 11 o'clock in the morning. And good morning to Harley Schlanger over in Potsdam, Germany, where I think it might be about 5 p.m. Am I right, Harley?
That's right. Exactly. 5:01 now.
Okay, well, how are you today, Harley?
Doing well. Doing very well.
Well, folks, it's great to have Harley Schlanger back here from the LaRouche organization and the Schiller Institute. And we are engaging in another of our biweekly conversations. It's very good to get back started. A lot of really serious stuff going on in the news, Harley. You want to start?
Sure. I mean, I'd like to start with a situation in Europe, which is not really being covered adequately in the United States. We see a little bit here and there, but there were three statements this last week, which I think characterize the move into desperation of European governments. First was Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, who said that she intends to do everything she can to support Ukraine. And she said, no matter what my German voters think. And she said, it's going to be difficult. There's going to be a crunch, high energy prices. It's going to be cold, but we have our responsibility. We made a commitment, no matter what my German voters think. Now, isn't that interesting? The so-called guardians of democracy say they don't care what the voters think. They're going to do what they want. Now, then Macron came out with a statement where he said, the age of abundance is over. Now, for much of the world, there never was an age of abundance. And I'm sure he's not talking about his friends in the Rothschild banking syndicate in France, ending the age of abundance. So this is a threat to increase the austerity against the average population in France. And then the Belgian prime minister said, this is going to be a terrible winter. The next 5 to 10 winters will be terrible. So you see in the minds of some of these Atlanticist hawks, they think the war is going to continue. They don't care what the effect is on the population. And then just add to that what Jerome Powell said a week and a few days ago at the Jackson Hole, Wyoming meeting, where he said, we're going to raise the interest rates. There will be some pain. And he said, if that doesn't stop the inflation, we'll have to go with the Volcker policy. Volcker raised the interest rates over 20%, the prime rate. So, you get an idea, some insights into how these guys are thinking. They don't care what happens to you. They've made a decision that they have to go all out to destroy Russia. And whatever the effect it is on their voters, on their populations, they don't care. They clearly don't care about the Ukrainian people because Ukraine is getting smashed. And we're told about this great offensive. There's no great offensive. The Ukrainians are having a very difficult time of it because they're outgunned, even with everything they've been getting from the West, assuming that some of it gets through. So this war represents a threat both to extend into something more serious and encompassing all of Europe, but at the same time, the economic effects of it are having a devastating effect on the population. Now, what's the line coming from all of these Western leaders? It's Putin's fault. Inflation is Putin's fault. Shortages are Putin's fault, and so on. Even though the inflation started long before the special military operation in Ukraine did. So, you just get a sense of the desperation to stick to a line and not be accountable. So I think that's, to me, the lead story of the week. And from there, we can go into Biden's strange new attacks on half the American population. There's quite a bit more we can talk about.
Indeed. And, I see these European, quote, leaders, unquote, as puppets.
Yeah.
And all I can see is, all I want to know is who's pulling the strings. And then we need to talk to that person because we could tell them to stop pulling the strings if we knew who they were, right? We could just go knock on the door and say, hey, would you please quit pulling the strings on these puppets? And so we can get back to normal. what is the thinking of the people behind the curtain that are pulling the strings? Is this really just a resource play for all the goodies in Russia?
No, it's not just for the goodies of Russia. It's to stop Russia from reorganizing the global financial system. I mean, what's at stake here is that we're heading into a meltdown of the financial system. Now, some people say this was an intent. Well, I think if the powers that be could control everything without having a meltdown, they would do it. They can't control it. It's gotten out of control because their policies, as they were grabbing more and more power, they were doing it with fraudulent economic policies, namely funny money. And so this is a case of the chickens coming home to roost. So what's their next best option? Well, how do you double down on this situation to keep the power without losing it? And there are two things here at play. One is war is always a good method to disorient a population or to divert attention from what's happening economically. Now, we're in an austerity regime in most of the Western world. And for the last 40 years, we've had very little experience with that. People expect to be able to use credit cards and to get access to credit, get cheap goods coming from China or Guatemala. Now, all of a sudden, that's drying up. And the money that we have is no longer worth much. So if they just continued this, that is, if they just continued the money pumping and the protecting of the bad debt with new money, the inflation would be so visible that you'd have a rebellion. So they're trying to figure out, how do you get rid of the inflation without losing their power? In other words, without giving up the claims they have based on the debt that they're holding. They're trying to figure out how to get real physical economy to back up the claims they have. And so that's what the Great Reset is, to loot, whether it's Russia, whether it's Brazil, whether it's North Dakota. They intend to loot whatever they can in terms of raw materials, in terms of cheap labor, in terms of manipulation of trade relations, manipulation of currencies. That's the game they play. That's the imperial game. Now, many of them concluded that the Great Reset, which most people associate with Klaus Schwab, but I can give you a little background on it, because before Klaus Schwab was a big player, this was already in motion. But you know, what they're looking at is how they can use the central banks to control not just currency and debt, but spending, take over the role of government in the hands of technocrats working for central banks, so that they'll always get paid back first, that the monetary system will always serve the interests of the most wealthy. Now, this, in the modern, most recent iteration, goes back to the post-1971 period and a group of people who set up something called the Trilateral Commission. Now, this was the grouping that put Jimmy Carter in the White House in 1976. And it included people who were part of something called the Project 1980s. And this included Harold Brown, who was the Defense Secretary, Michael Blumenthal, who was the Treasury Secretary, for a period of time, G. William Miller, who was the Federal Reserve Chairman, until they booted him out and put in Paul Volcker. And it included also, very prominently, Zbigniew Brzezinski. The 1980s project was 26 volumes, but the most important one was the one that Volcker was involved in preparing, called Controlled Disintegration. And Volcker in 1976 told the Congress the American standard of living is too high. And in this book that he was a co-author of, this report, what he said is that we need a controlled disintegration of the financial system. That was the intent of the high interest rates once Volcker became Federal Reserve Chairman. It was to drive a certain number of farmers off the land. It was a land takeover long before BlackRock and Vanguard started doing it. It was working with the grain cartels. It was working with the largest banks. And it was using the World Trade Organization to control the global distribution of food, so that you could replace American exports with exports from poor countries in Africa and South America, with cheaper labor, no quality control. And this is what led to, I don't know if you were old enough to, I think you are old enough to remember this. In the late 70s, there were tractorcades. Farmers were driving from all over the country into Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
About 200,000 farmers were in Washington. They could have changed everything, except they sold out because the cartels came in and said, okay, we hear your message. We'll help you out. We'll get the prices up a little bit. And don't worry, we have a lobby group that will help you. And the farmers had not been involved politically, and they basically got swindled and bamboozled. And this process continued. So the 1980s project of Volcker carried on through the 80s. Now, we were told we had great prosperity in the 80s. What was that based on? Was it based on Volcker squeezing all the money out of the economy in the early 80s? No, it was based on opening the pumps again for the defense sector and the huge defense buildup in the Reagan years, which created the aura of economic prosperity. That blew out in 1987 when the bubble popped. And then we were in the George H.W. Bush years, which were years of austerity. Then Clinton came in, and Clinton came in saying, oh, we're going to have cheap interest, we're going to invest in infrastructure. And right before he was inaugurated, he had lunch with Greenspan, and Greenspan said, not so fast, buddy, you can't do that. You've got to make Wall Street happy. If you make Wall Street happy, you'll be a successful president. And much of what Clinton intended was shelved. And they continued the bubble economy through the 1997 Asia bubble popping, the 1998 Russian bonds popping, and then 2000, the dot-com bubble popping. So, if you look back over this, what you see is we've gone through a series of cycles, boom-bust cycles. The main portion of the population got some benefit because some of this does spill over. If the interest rates are lower, you can use your credit card. If goods are cheaper, you can buy goods cheaper. But you build up debt, and the debt comes back to blow up again, as it did in 2008. A lot of people, 2004 through 2007, thought they were doing really well because they saw their house values going way up. They were borrowing against it. And they were saying, well, don't worry, I can always pay this off because the house prices will keep going up. Well, as Greenspan correctly said, although I don't think he intended to be right, this was irrational exuberance. And it turned out to be irrational exuberance because the houses were actually not getting worth more. They were getting worth less. People couldn't afford the prices they were paying. We had the mortgage-backed security pop in bubble pop in 2008. And from then until now, the only time we've had apparent prosperity is when the absolutely cheap interest rates led to a big growth in the stock market so that the average person could make a little bit of money from that, thinking that everything was good. And now we're seeing that bubble blow out. So the actual Great Reset is a 50-year in the making swindle of the wealthiest financial cartel and corporate cartel operatives who are now trying to go to the next phase. And the next phase is they're basically going to say, you just relax, we'll make sure you have enough to live. And in the meantime, you stay out of politics, we'll make the decisions. In other words, no more sovereignty for any country. Now, that's what got us into trouble with Ukraine. The Ukraine situation, all the Western elites saw Ukraine as a pile of money waiting to be stolen. And, we hear a lot about Hunter Biden and the Biden team and so on. But this was also major banks. Look who's in Ukraine right now. It's BlackRock, it's Vanguard, it's JP Morgan Chase. They're all taking a chunk out of Ukraine because Ukraine has raw materials and they have some production capability. So we're just dealing with compounded thievery and corruption. And this is going to have to stop at some point. And if it doesn't stop because of a total blowout, it'll stop because of nuclear war or because of an awakening in the people who say, we're not going to do this anymore. Hopefully the latter is what will happen.
Funny, there was a little internet glitch when you said the awakening of the people, and it was like just a little hiccup in the transmission, but an awakening of the people will happen. Uh, well, a lot in what you said, I would love to get back into a little bit deeper. One quick question: Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Where did his loyalties really lie? I suggest he might have been actually a synarchist, one of the Coudenhove Kalergi types, or something like that. What's your opinion?
Well, Brzezinski is one of these Eastern European emigres, not so different from Kissinger. There are quite a few of these guys who found their way into leading university positions. In the case of Kissinger, it was through William Yandell Elliott, who was basically an operative of the Fabian Society. He was at Harvard, and he recruited a whole team of people, including Samuel P. Huntington, the guy who wrote Clash of Civilizations. Kissinger was part of that. And Brzezinski, and that was the Republican side. Brzezinski came through the Democratic Party side of this, the networks that, I mean, he spawned Madeleine Albright and the others. But you're right, this is a grouping that owes its loyalty to a certain ideology. And the ideology is essentially funded by bankers. In some cases, it was Democratic Party bankers. In other cases, it was Republican Party bankers. But these are bankers who are above poised above it. Brzezinski's network was largely the network of Felix Rohatyn.
Okay.
Rohatyn was Lazard Frere. And that's the grouping that paved the way for Brzezinski. Now, Brzezinski was known as a hardline anti-communist because he hated Russia. He was from a lower nobility family from Poland. And that was pretty much what shaped his worldview. Brzezinski also attached himself to British intelligence in the form of loyalty to the outlook of Bernard Lewis, who was the so-called Arab scholar from Britain, who recruited a whole gang of the Arabists that took over Middle Eastern policy and worked for oil companies and defense contractors. And Bernard Lewis was really a product of the old Fabian Society also. So much of this goes back to the Fabian Society. Now, what were the Fabians? They were the British banking families. They were the British merchant families. And by merchant, I mean the steamboats and then the control of trade. And of course, the banking families and the people who built the ports all over the world. These were the networks that were constantly trying to figure out, once they couldn't subvert the American Revolution, how to get America to join the British side. And that's where people like Brzezinski and Kissinger come from. Slightly different flavors, but that's the outlook. And Brzezinski was a geopolitician to the core. His whole theory, which again he took from Bernard Lewis, who got it from Mackinder, his theory was that you have the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, which is the Islamic card. And he actually talked about this, play the Islamic card. And we saw it happen with what he did to manipulate the situation in Afghanistan. Brzezinski was working with networks in the Hindu Kush, or the Afghanistan area, that trace back to the great game in the 1840s and 50s, the British networks. And Brzezinski's idea was you could use Islamic fundamentalism to undermine the Soviet attempt to upgrade that part of the world with science and technology. And so this is where you have the leftovers of the Xinjiang, Uyghur, Islamist networks. This is what Al-Qaeda came out of. This is what the Taliban came out of. And who funded it? Who organized it? Well, in Afghanistan, it was a project started by Brzezinski, who literally organized the Afghan rebellion against the pro-Soviet regime in Afghanistan. And when the fighting started there in the early 80s, Brzezinski was no longer in the government. Kissinger and actually the neocon crowd had come in. But Brzezinski worked through the intelligence community on the project to arm the Afghan so-called freedom fighters against the Soviets. That became the Taliban. And meanwhile, you had the Bush family organizing with bin Laden to create what became ISIS. So those two operations, ISIS and Taliban, or Al-Qaeda and Taliban, were largely fostered and developed by American intelligence networks and Saudi money. And we're still paying the price for that.
I appreciate that very much. Brzezinski's being connected to Rohatyn makes a lot of sense to me. And I just, as a footnote, I noticed that Rohatyn is actually a name that is associated with the ancient culture of Ruthenia. Ruthenia is if you've ever seen that name, it's one of those countries that sometimes existed and sometimes didn't in the area of between Poland, Ukraine, and and that same area. So it's very likely that he has Ukrainian roots just by virtue of that name. There is a town called Rohatyn in, I think, western Ukraine. So very, very interesting, because that, to me, it ties the use of the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators in World War II, directly to what's going on now. And I've also, when you mentioned the British banking families and the Fabian Society, we connect that directly to the author Sir, I think, Edward Bulmer Lytton, who wrote a book about the Vril Society, the VRILs, and all this goes into this esoteric stuff about space aliens and women with gorgeous long hair named Maria Orsic, and all of this stuff that I've looked into just to try to follow the rabbit holes. Well, that mythology is the same thing that Himmler was pushing in the Third Reich. And that brings me to this comment I have about the symbol called the Black Sun. This symbol called the Black Sun, which is said to be a bunch of Sig runes concentrically arranged in a circle that derives from a pattern that was created by Himmler on the floor of a castle in a place called Wewelsberg. That is the place where he had his high seances or his high meetings with his SS, esoteric side. And that Black Sun now has been adopted by the Azov Brigade, right?
Yeah. Now, and it was on the arm of the person who tried to shoot Cristina Fernandez, the vice president of Argentina, the other day. He had the Black Sun symbol, and the shooter in Buffalo had it. This is, I was just on a conference call today.
New England.
Go ahead.
Just Christchurch in New Zealand, the same thing.
Yeah.
And add to that the number of assassinations going on around the world right now. And I don't know, but I'm sorry I interrupted you. I just wanted to make sure that there's a strong pattern here of these assassins showing up with these Black Sun symbols. And what I thought was very fascinating this morning, I noticed, was that the historical articles that you read say Himmler is the source of this symbol. However, if you look into other stuff, and I saw a post by the ADL, the Anti-Discrimination League, saying that this is an old pagan symbol that the Norse had and the Celtics had, and it's just this old pagan symbol. In other words, it could be, and I'm suggesting that it might be, that organizations associated with the ADL and others may see a need to legitimize the Black Sun symbol because it is so prominent in the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian people are being instructed to just consider it, it's just a symbol. Whereas the historical fact is, according to historians, that this is a creation of Heinrich Himmler, which means it is in fact a Nazi symbol. So the 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 ties between old British intelligence, the Vril Society people now use the black sun as one of their symbols.
Mhm.
So all of this to me, Harley, just gets me into, my old Webster Tarpley, this British imperial system has created these dark mythologies of bestiality and torture and murder, as a kind of a positive good, along the lines of the you know the British intelligence, Aleister Crowley types. It all ties together. In other words, I'm sorry to take so much time.
No, that's okay, because when you talk about the Nazis, you had the Tula Society, which was returned to the idea of the Norse gods and Odin. And these things were there as part of the mythical symbols of power. And, I was just reading something, I just started it, but there's a whole series of books on the way the British tried to manipulate Hitler's inner circle using astrology. And, when you have an irrational movement based on something such as extreme as racial roots, racialism, you can pretty much introduce any kind of mythical theories and move people around them. And, what you do is you create a sense of superiority outside of the human race. That is, that their superior breeding entitles them to do whatever they want, to treat people like human cattle. And so this is, of course, the Roman cults. The same thing was there. The British studied Rome very carefully. The famous study is Gibbon's work on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. But there are many, many unpublished works that were kept in something called the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in the basement of one of the Oxford colleges. Ashmole was the guy who founded the modern version of Scottish Rite Freemasonry.
Oh boy.
And we're talking about these kinds of things. They did character studies of national identity to figure out how to control and manipulate people. And these are the networks that produce the Brzezinskis and produce the Kissingers and the Samuel P. Huntingtons. And the spawns of them. Brzezinski spawned the Madeleine Albright grouping. And who do we have today from the Albright grouping? Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were proteges of Madeleine Albright, who famously said she thought that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children due to sanctions was an acceptable price to pay to get rid of Saddam. So when you talk about a satanic outlook, LaRouche used to joke, he used to call her Madeleine Half-Bright. But the other side of that is, it's not a question of intelligence, it's a question of evil. Someone who does not see in a child a potential for creative discovery, but sees in a child something you can use, whether it's for sexual pleasure or as a slave. And that's what you're dealing with when we talk about the gods of Olympus. So, very often with LaRouche, we end up in discussions of things such as the importance of the plays of Aeschylus, the Promethean story, the story of Prometheus, the idea that the gods of Olympus actually believed, to the extent there were humans who identified with the gods, they believed they were more powerful. And so that's what we're dealing with. And the reality, though, is if you look at them and look at how they're organizing things today, you see that they're delusional. They actually believe that they possess supernatural powers, when in fact, they just command armies. They command brainwashers. They have access to the ability to launch what's called hybrid warfare. We're doing a whole study now, John, on this whole hybrid warfare operation, tracing it back to the, among other things, Sir William Stevenson. You might find this interesting, given your interest in the World War II post-war development of intelligence in the United States. Stevenson is usually credited with being one of the key people in shaping the development of the OSS and then the CIA. He was a cyber guy back before there was anything known much about cyber works. His argument was that warfare, that intelligence precedes warfare. Before you become a military power, you have to have intelligence, both to know what the enemy is doing, but also to know how to manipulate the population. And this is what we're seeing today with the control of narratives, with the what they call hybrid warfare. Like for example, the great Donbass offensive of the Ukrainian army. We've been told the counteroffensive is coming, it's winning, it's successful. Then you talk to people in the military and they say it's nothing, it's not working, it's grinding up more Ukrainian soldiers. Where's the precedent for this? Well, Stevenson, in 1941, when the British fled Dunkirk, after they were pretty much destroyed by the Germans and driven off the European continent in disgrace, and barely able to get across the channel and keep their army intact, Stevenson put out through BBC and other British journals the story of a successful British expeditionary attack on a Nazi stronghold further up on the Atlantic coast, where they routed the Nazis, destroyed 30 planes, the whole big story. Turned out to be completely made up. But Stevenson said we had to do that to improve the morale of the people in Britain. So this is what we're seeing with the great Zelensky counteroffensive. They're just destroying the people of Ukraine in the name of defending Ukrainian freedom and sovereignty.
That's a great point, and I accept it, and I think a lot of people do. But let's go a little bit further, if I can. I think by just destroying Ukraine in this meat grinder approach, with the United States and Europe being the unending source of money, our economies, your lifestyle, your heating budget, all of these things are going sour and very badly against the individual person, not just in Ukraine, but all over Europe and the United States as well, although we're kind of cushioned from it right now
A little bit.
by political maneuvering. But, Europe is getting set up to really, really fall. I mean, take a serious fall. And one way to look at it is that that's really the goal, to demoralize, depopulate, and destroy the inherent, what's left of European culture, and to leave a wasteland for future development by the powers that be, the phoenix rising out of the ashes. What do you think? Is Europe really the target here and not just Ukraine?
Well, Europe is definitely a target, and this goes back to the time of Bismarck, when Germany finally broke from being a somewhat medieval feudal country that had a few somewhat wealthy city-states or small duchies or little entities that had some power. But what Bismarck did when he unified Germany is, when he first did it, he launched something which became basically a real estate speculation operation. And he was told by a couple of very intelligent bankers who were wanting to fund industry, this won't work. Instead, they started studying the works of Friedrich List, who was a student of Alexander Hamilton. And List came up with a project called the Customs Union, or the Zollverein, which began the unification of Germany through knocking down tariffs between the various city-states and little kingdoms. And pretty soon, this became the basis of Bismarck coming in, and he realized that Germany had superior quality of culture. If you think about the Weimar period, you think about Beethoven, Schiller, Goethe, Heine, Schubert. You had incredible culture and science, because there was an interrelationship between the science and the culture, typified by such families as the Mendelssohn family. Moses Mendelssohn, the philosopher, his grandson or his sons were bankers who funded industry in Berlin, and his grandson was Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. So you had these kinds of potentials that when Bismarck finally realized that they had to do something different for the economy, he dumped the what today we call neoliberalism, and went with a Hamiltonian policy, a credit policy for industry, a tariff policy to keep out cheap Russian grain and cheap British steel. And all of a sudden, Germany blossomed as an industrial power in the last decade of the 19th century. And the British were terrified that their other historic enemy, which was Russia, the two historic enemies of Britain were France and Russia. The French were pretty much weakened by that time, and the British weren't so worried about them, especially after the Dreyfus affair and other kinds of setbacks to the French Empire in Africa. But they were terrified that if France and Germany got together with Russia, that would be the end of the British world trade control. And so they focused on Germany and Russia, keeping them apart. Now, Germany, after World War I, was punished. When World War I was as much the fault of the British and the French as it was the Kaiser. But Germany was punished. The Germans and Russians tried to work a deal with the Rapallo Treaty, and that was stopped by the British. It was stopped by the assassination of the architect of it, Walter Rathenau, which is a typical way of stopping these kinds of changes. And then what happened after World War II was Germany started growing up again. But now you had the Iron Curtain. You had the division of Europe between East and West. Now, the worst thing that happened in Europe was the idea of the European Union, which differed from what de Gaulle had in mind. De Gaulle and Roosevelt and others had this idea of sovereign states that would form a common market. Instead, what became the basis of the European Union was giving up sovereignty and establishing some kind of federal system, which, it's not like the United States where you had one language and pretty much not exactly a homogenous culture, but around the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, you had a certain sense of a mission for a nation. You don't have that in Europe. You have all different kinds of local formations and cultural attributes and so on. That doesn't mean you can't have peace. But what they said is peace depends on having it all under control of essentially Britain and the United States, with NATO as the enforcer. And then you can unleash the German economy. And that's what we had in the 60s and 70s. But at the same time, the intent was to use NATO to prevent the development of the third world in order to keep the monetary policy, the dollar, the petrodollar policy, keep the money in the Western banks and the control in the hands of the bankers. That's where people like Rohatyn fit in, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and others. All of them had somewhat similar view that there's too many people in the poor countries and actually too many people in the rich countries as well. So they launched the environmentalist movement. Now, all of this is to come back to Ukraine. What is Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine actually has very rich land. It's got strategic metals and resources. The population of Ukraine historically has produced some cultural figures, some scientists. Vladimir Vernadsky is an example. But it never really had a national identity. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of the more developed countries in the Warsaw Pact and in the Soviet side of things. That got stripped down to the bones the same way Russia did with shock therapy. And as it was beginning to grow back again a little bit, you had 2014, the Maidan coup. And what was the first thing that was done? They were told the new government can join the European Union, but it has to go under the International Monetary Fund first. And so the looting escalated. Ukraine's poverty was not the result of the Soviet system. Actually, the Soviet system, Ukraine was one of the countries that actually benefited from that. It was weakened by the British shock therapy policy after the collapse of communism, and then made worse after 2014. So, if you're a Ukrainian and you're told, don't worry, the EU will come in, you'll get lots of credit, everything will be good. And then you look at what's happening. It's turned into a military dumping ground to be deployed against Russia. So, the average Ukrainian feels betrayed, but they're told it's Putin, it's the Russians that did it. And out of that, you have this grouping from Western Ukraine that's literally pro-Nazi in the sense that their outlook is against all foreigners. And who do they consider foreigners? Romanians, Poles, Hungarians, and Jews. And you had vicious pogroms in Western Ukraine, which is the center of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, out of which became the Azov Battalion and the Right Sector and so on. They were the collaborators with the Nazi SS in the 1940s when the Germans took over Ukraine. That's who Stefan Bandera was, a Ukrainian nationalist who sometimes had his disagreements with the Nazis, but nevertheless used the Nazi policy to exterminate the non-Ukrainian population. Now, interestingly, John, the current Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather was put in charge of a newspaper in Lviv in Ukraine, which was the Nazi paper which called for pogroms against the Jews. So her grandfather was an out-and-out Nazi collaborator. And that's why when you look at Canada, you see Canada as one of the most pro-Ukraine countries in terms of contributing money, arms, and so on. And it's got a large Ukrainian population there. Not all of them are bad, but certainly some of them are Banderites, the name for the alliance to Bandera. So it's one of these things where you see the mix of geography, history, culture makes the situation difficult. Now, just to finish the point on Europe, what would have happened? Well, what would happen now if the Germans suddenly said, we're not going to starve our people, we're not going to freeze them this winter, we're going to mobilize for a diplomatic solution and stop arming Ukraine? What would the US do? What could we do? What would NATO do? Pull off a coup? Well, in a sense, they already have a coup. You've got a nothing chancellor being run by these two green lunatics, Baerbock and Habeck. You have this change now in the United Kingdom. Look at the situation in Britain. Today, the power was handed over to Liz Truss. She thinks that she's the new Iron Lady. She's more like the tin hat lady. She out and out said she's prepared to push the nuclear button if she has to. She's for austerity. Well, in England now, in the United Kingdom, you have inflation running over 10%, heading toward 20%. Fuel is completely cost prohibitive for most people. The British government doesn't have funds really to subsidize them. So what's she going to do? Austerity. They're pretending it's World War II or Maggie Thatcher during the Falkland Islands. But will the people in the United Kingdom buy it? Well, that's why they set up these things called behavioral insight teams inside the British cabinet to figure out how to manipulate people to accept the circumstances they live in. But how do you get people who are freezing in the dark to accept that? How do you get mothers looking at hungry children or adults looking at very hungry and sick elderly pensioners? How do you get them to accept the idea through behavior modification that this is really okay, we're doing it for Ukraine? And that's why everyone you talk to in Europe, when you ask them, what do you see in the weeks and months ahead? They say a hot autumn and a hotter winter. Demonstrations, protests, governments falling. Already governments have been falling. The Italian government fell. Macron is hanging on by the skin of his teeth. there are rumors that Schultz may be dumped in Germany. So you had very large demonstrations in the Czech Republic in Prague just a couple of days ago. So I think this is going to be an extremely difficult period ahead. And the good side of that is that as people wake up, they're going to have to start asking the question, why are we doing this? How do we benefit as Germans or as French or as Italians or as Americans by funding a war against Russia? And hopefully more people will start asking that question. And how can we say we're the democratic side in the world when we have our leaders say, I don't care what my German voters think? And where's the democracy?
I saw a comment this morning from Scott Adams on Twitter, who said that Biden is a fearmonger. He's using fear to keep control of us, and that the only person that can possibly challenge him or his successor the next time is Trump, because Trump is an even better fearmonger than Biden. And that it's only that fear has been proven to be the only workable motivator to achieve, a public consensus or support for your policy. That reminds me of the studies of the infamous Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill University in Canada, where he was basically trying to establish what is the most motivating thing that you can find for a human being. And he conclusively decided that it was fear, both on an individual level, as he proved it, but also on a national level, as I think our more astute political philosophers have found out. You apply a great deal of reason at the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization. And I can't think of anybody that has a more reason-oriented mind than what I've seen of Lyndon LaRouche in his really wonderful presentations that you can find all over the internet. But when fear is the prime motivator, what can we do? How can we move forward? And as Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, that's a good line. What's the modern version, and how do we get out of this box?
Well, there's no simple way to get out of it other than to increase the numbers of people who become creative thinkers, self-critical thinkers. And that requires, among other things, very sharp irony. One of the things, if I were Donald Trump and I saw Biden's speech from last Friday about the American people, half the American population is a threat to our democracy, and calling them semi-fascists, I would ask the question, who's arming the Nazis in Ukraine? My supporters don't want to arm Nazis. You're the one arming the Nazis. Who are the fascists? At least you force people to think. You talk about democracy, and then you say, well, we're going to do what we want to do, whether you like it or not, as in the case of Baerbock. You have to bring up the contradictions in the hope and expectation that as things get worse, and LaRouche once said, what happens when you come home at night, you turn on the light switch and the oven goes on, you turn on the faucet and the phone rings, where everything you expect doesn't work. That's where we are with the economy. You cut credit by raising interest rates, it's not going to work. It's not going to stop inflation. The problem is the thinking, the way people think. And this is a product of the education system being destroyed, that people know no history. They don't know how we got here. They don't know who has power. And what you have to do is you keep chipping away at that and give people a sense that they do possess a capability to figure out what's wrong and what can be done. And our hope is that you use, on the one hand, very sharp polemics, but then also give people an understanding of what's the nature of man. You appeal to this higher potential, higher purpose of every human being. Who wants to live and die a life with no meaning? People want some meaning, but they're deprived of that right now. And this is why LaRouche always used to ask the question when he was meeting with us when we were young. He said, imagine, and this is from a New Yorker cartoon, John. He said, imagine you're given one last moment of consciousness after you die. You sit up in your coffin and you look around the room and you say, what was that all about? Now, how do you answer that? Can you say, I did something that was useful for humanity? I left something better behind than what I came into? That's what people really aspire to. That's what the idea of immortality is, the immortality of the soul. And it's what gives people comfort and satisfaction to know that they're irreplaceable, even if it's as a father and a provider of food for a family. And if you can then extend that to doing good for a community, doing good for a nation, then you give people a sense of purpose. I think most people are hungry for a sense of purpose, but the fear comes in when you begin to think there's no way you can get there. There's nothing you can do. You don't have enough money. You don't have enough time. The rat race is bearing down on you. And people need to take a minute to step back and reflect. And sometimes to get them to do that, you have to say things that are very sharp and go at the assumptions that people have. I mean, that's my approach in organizing. I don't know how well it works. I think some people are reached, and some people are very difficult to reach. They're willing to die with their bad ideas.
Wow, that's a terrible thing to think of, but you're right. And I'd almost say most people are willing to die with their bad ideas. It's been a lesson I've learned ever since the COVID thing started, and friends just drift away. Um, in in terms of sharp attacks, I can't imagine a sharper attack than being placed on a blacklist, a hit. I think of Paul Robeson, my great hero as a vocalist, being blacklisted and then being abused and having his mind messed with by CIA mind control programs. And once you're on a blacklist, that's bad. And you're on a blacklist. You're going to be addressing that, at least the Schiller Institute will be tomorrow at a press conference. I hope you can tell us a little bit more about what the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization are doing in response to this horrific act of placing you and a number of your colleagues on a hit list practically, and calling that out and doing what we can to suppress that type of activity on behalf of people that oppose us.
Well, Helga and I are near the top of the recent list put out by Mirotvorets, which means peacekeeper, which is the website that targets people who they call information terrorists who are promoting Russian propaganda. Also on the Mirotvorets list was Daria Dugin, who was assassinated in Moscow 10 days ago. People like Glenn Greenwald is on the list. Ray McGovern is on the list. Tulsi Gabbard. My friend and colleague Diane Sayre, candidate for U.S. Senate in New York, is on the list. And what's our crime? Our crime is we're saying that Ukraine should negotiate. We should stop the fighting. NATO should stop providing weapons. This idea that you're going to beat Russia in a war is a delusion, and all you're doing is killing your own people by sticking with that. Now, to them, that's Putin disinformation. And so what we're doing is we're going to the Congress and pointing out that the U.S. government is funding this. On September 1st and 2nd, they had a conference in Kiev to lay out what they're going to do, including targeting more people. And there were 24 Western governments in the room, including U.S. officials. Chuck Schumer made sure that $1.7 billion went to fund Ukrainian government operations, which include this people putting out the hit list targeting his opponent in New York Senate race. So we're going to the Congress, we're going to the American people and saying, this is designed to silence us, either by intimidating us or killing us. And it's aimed at you so that you don't have an alternative. You just have to submit. Now, we're going to have a press conference tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. There'll be a link up at the Schiller Institute site, and we'll have people such as Scott Ritter will be speaking. Scott Ritter has become a very strong defender of Diane Sayre and going after Schumer and the Congress. Ray McGovern, a very well-known former CIA operative and one of the founders of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, he'll be speaking. Helga LaRouche will speak. Hopefully we'll have a number of others, because there were 72 people put on this list, 30 of whom had spoken at Schiller Institute conferences. Now, who's targeting us? It's not the Ukrainians, it's NATO, it's the State Department, it's the intelligence community. And they're targeting us because we have been identifying them as the problem. And they're targeting us with a gang of thugs and assassins, many of whom come from the depths of the neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine. So people can go to our website, you can see the material we've put out on this, and call your congressman and ask them, why are we funding neo-Nazis who are targeting Americans who are saying we should have a dialogue? I mean, that's a simple way to put it, but that's the reality.
Serious business, folks,
Yeah.
very serious business. And I don't care if you agree with everything or even nothing that the Schiller Institute says and the LaRouche organization says. You have your own interest personally in this, because freedom of speech is freedom of speech. And when it's chilled by threats, by these dark forces that wear these black sun emblems and try to instill terror through assassinations and through esoteric symbols and things, you have to take it very seriously. It sounds an awful lot like what the Nazis were doing in World War II. Very serious business, folks. And so tomorrow at 11 a.m., the press conference, you can get the details at schillerinstitute.com. Harley, anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
Well, then also this coming weekend, Saturday and Sunday, we're going to have a 2-day conference, which will be an extended dialogue on how to guarantee security for all nations, including Ukraine and Russia, and a financial system that's fair and just. These are the things that Lyndon LaRouche stood for. Thursday would be the 100th anniversary of LaRouche's birth. So the next few days will be a lot of activity we're engaged in. But if you want to, you can go register at the Schiller Institute for the press conference tomorrow and for the 2-day conference Saturday and Sunday.
All right. Excellent. That'll wrap it up for us. Thank you so much, Harley Schlanger, over in Potsdam, Germany, with the Schiller Institute. And we will be back tomorrow with more here at McDuff Lives.